When the war ended in 16 hours instead of 16 years, every military academy in the galaxy wanted to know the same thing. How did a quiet human cadet defeat an enemy that had been designed to be unbeatable? The answer was simple. Jessica Covington had spent her whole life learning one lesson her alien classmates never had to. Fair fights are for people who can afford to lose. But let me start at the beginning, when the deadliest weapon in known space was a 17-year-old girl who drew sailing ships in her notebooks. The Academy's corridors smelled like recycled air, and the nervous sweat of 30 different species trying to prove they belonged there. Jessica's footsteps echoed differently than her classmates. Human rubber soles instead of Zenthari combat talons, or Valorian gravitic dampeners. She'd learned to walk quietly during her first week, after realizing that the sound of human movement made other species nervous. Apparently, humans stepped differently when they were thinking about hunting something. The Galactic Naval Academy's final simulation wasn't just an academic exercise, it determined placement in the fleet hierarchy. Fail here, and you'd spend your career commanding garbage scows in systems nobody cared about. Excel, and you might actually live long enough to retire with all your original limbs. Jessica had been preparing for this test in ways the Academy didn't know she'd discovered. Her grandfather had been a merchant marine who'd survived 3 separate pirate attacks during Earth's colonial expansion. His bedtime stories weren't about princesses, they were about Captain Phillips, who'd outfoxed Somali raiders with nothing but cargo containers and creative thinking. Never fight fair when survival's on the line. Jess, he'd told her while teaching her to play chess with moves that weren't in any book. Fair fights are for people who can afford to lose. Jessica traced the chess piece her grandfather had carved from ship metal. Never fight fair, she whispered, then deleted the tactical analysis that would have horrified him. Some lessons took root in ways their teachers never intended. The Academy's dining hall buzzed with the controlled chaos of 30 species trying to share mealtime without triggering anyone's ancestral prey responses. Jessica sat near the library's naval history section, reading books with titles like Fighting Instructions of the Royal Navy, while eating protein paste that tasted like defeat. Sephara, her Valorian roommate, slid her crystalline form into the opposite seat. The probability matrices for tomorrow's simulation don't account for deliberately irrational behavior, she said without preamble. How do you calculate strategy against opponents who ignore optimal outcomes? You don't calculate, Jessica replied, not looking up from a diagram of 18th century ship formations. You adapt. But adaptation requires predictive modeling. If the enemy's behavior patterns fall outside established parameters, then you throw out the parameters. Jessica finally met her roommate's confused gaze. Sometimes, the best strategy is the one nobody expects, because it's supposed to be impossible. Across the dining hall, Crick's Shadowbane's voice cut through the multilingual chatter. Your ancestors fought with metal and cloth against real warriors? His claws extended slightly in what passed for Zenthari amusement. How did any of them survive to breed? Jessica's smile was small and quiet. Creative violence and superior logistics. The dining hall fell silent except for the hum of life support and 30 different breathing patterns that evolution had never intended to harmonize. Commander Veltar's tactical instruction had reached the mathematical elegance of the phalanx formation when Jessica's hand rose like a red flag against conventional wisdom. Cadet Covington, the commander's mandibles clicked in recognition. What happens if the enemy doesn't want to be mathematically elegant? The mandibles stopped mid-click. Commander Veltar turned to stare at Jessica like furniture that had suddenly started offering tactical advice. Behind him, the holographic formation diagram flickered as if the display itself was confused. Elaborate. Cadet Covington. Jessica's stylus traced patterns on her tablet that looked like random sketches but were actually 3-dimensional tactical diagrams. The phalanx formation assumes the enemy will approach in organized battle lines, right? But what if they just don't? 30 pairs of eyes focused on Jessica with the intensity of targeting lasers painting a single point. The classroom's air recycling system seemed louder in the sudden quiet. What if they scatter and attack from 6 directions at once? Jessica continued, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd learned that adults got nervous when teenagers pointed out obvious problems. What if they pretend to retreat and lead you into an ambush? What if they ignore your formation entirely and just ram your command ship with a cargo hauler? The silence stretched until it became a living thing, feeding on the collective anxiety of students realizing their fundamental assumptions might be flawed. All civilized species understand formation, combat, Commander Veltar said finally, his mandibles resuming their steady rhythm. It's the foundation of honorable warfare. But what if they're not civilized? Jessica asked with the innocent curiosity of someone genuinely trying to understand why adults made things so complicated. Or don't care about honor? Sapphira's crystalline features dimmed to the pale blue of deep concern. That's chaos, she whispered. No, Jessica replied quietly, still sketching patterns that would have given Admiral Nelson nightmares. That's Tuesday. By week 6, Jessica's questions had become legendary. What if they don't want to be elegant? Had spawned late-night debates in 7 languages. Even the vending machine seemed to pause when she raised her hand. The Academy's library had become Jessica's second dormitory. She'd claimed the corner table near the anthropological section, surrounded by books that the Galactic Military Establishment had filed under historical curiosities. Detailed analyses of pre-contact human warfare, written by officers who'd probably never imagined a human cadet would use their own research to identify gaps in contemporary tactical thinking. Day 41, Jessica wrote in her private notes, using an old Earth cipher that looked like technical sketches of nautical equipment. Academy doctrine optimized for symmetric engagements between technological equals using established honor codes. Strength, mathematical precision, and predictable outcomes. Weakness assumes enemies share cultural values regarding appropriate warfare methodology. Around her, the sounds of 30 different species settling into sleep cycles filtered through the station's bulkheads, each dreaming of military glory earned through proper application of established doctrine. Hypothesis: current tactical education vulnerable to irregular warfare techniques. Historical precedent suggests asymmetric approaches often defeat symmetric doctrine when properly applied. Jessica paused, listening to the subtle harmony of hyperspace engines that kept the Academy station positioned in stable orbit. Further research required. What she didn't write was that she'd already found the further research. Hidden in anthropological studies and historical analyses were the tactical innovations of humans who'd made careers out of convincing superior enemies to fight battles they couldn't win. The first practical demonstration arrived during a routine convoy protection exercise. Standard Academy curriculum: defend merchant vessels against raiders using available fleet resources. Straightforward scenario: clear objectives, established solutions that had been refined over centuries of successful application. Jessica's classmates approached the problem with methods their species had perfected through generations of honorable warfare. The Zenthari formed battle lines and challenged the raiders to single combat. The Valorians calculated optimal formation rotations to maximize shield efficiency. The Keth created mathematical models that predicted enemy behavior based on logical tactical analysis. Jessica made the convoy disappear. Clarification requested. Commander Veltar said slowly, studying tactical displays that showed empty space where a heavily defended convoy should have been. The holographic projection painted his compound eyes in shifting blues and reds. Cadet Covington, where are your protected assets? Safe. Jessica's fingers moved across the interface with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb made of light and mathematics. The raiders can't attack what they can't find, but the exercise parameters require convoy protection during transit through hostile space. Right, so I moved the convoy to non-hostile space and left decoys in the original route. Jessica manipulated the display, revealing her actual convoy threading through an asteroid field that regulations classified as navigationally inadvisable. The raiders are attacking empty cargo containers with transponder beacons, while the real ships take the scenic route. The classroom buzzed with confused chatter in 7 different languages, most of which translated roughly to, "Is that legal?" Commander Veltar's mandibles clicked in rapid patterns that suggested his worldview was undergoing emergency reconstruction. This approach violates established convoy protection protocols. But it works, Jessica pointed out reasonably. The convoy reaches its destination, the cargo stays intact, and nobody dies. Mission accomplished. Crick's Shadowbane's claws scraped against his desk, in the nervous pattern unique to Zenthari, experiencing moral confusion. This is deception. Honorable warfare requires direct engagement with clearly identified combatants. Jessica looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow student. Honorable warfare is for people who can afford to lose. The convoy's job is to deliver cargo, not to give raiders a fair fight. The words hung in the air like the echo of a weapon discharge, reverberating through military philosophy that had stood unchallenged for centuries. 3 weeks later, Jessica found herself assigned to advanced strategic research under direct faculty supervision. Her new office was a converted storage compartment adjacent to the Academy's classified research wing, equipped with access to materials that first-year cadets weren't supposed to know existed. Admiral Cathara's scales had faded to the silver of long experience and accumulated wisdom. She studied Jessica across a desk laden with tactical analyses from conflicts that officially had never happened. Your irregular warfare assessments have created considerable discussion among the faculty, the Admiral said, her voice carrying undertones that suggested Jessica's academic career had taken an interesting turn. We'd like your opinion on some theoretical scenarios. The holographic displays that materialized around Jessica's chair showed battle formations that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Enemy forces that scattered when engaged, refused decisive battles, and treated military assets like disposable game pieces in a contest with rules nobody else understood. These patterns, Admiral Cathara continued, represent potential threats from hypothetical opponents who might not share our assumptions about appropriate conduct during warfare. Jessica studied the displays with the focused intensity of someone reading her grandfather's chess problems. Movement patterns that looked chaotic resolved into familiar shapes when viewed through the lens of historical precedent. Admiral, she said quietly, this isn't hypothetical. These are 18th century commerce raiding tactics adapted for space warfare. The Admiral's expression shifted from professional curiosity to the kind of sharp attention that preceded either breakthrough discoveries or career-ending scandals. Elaborate. Hit and run. Refuse decisive engagement. Use superior mobility to avoid enemy strengths while targeting infrastructure. Jessica's fingers traced attack vectors through the holographic space. That's not advanced warfare. That's exactly what Admiral Yi Sun-sin used against Japanese invasion fleets in 1592, and Captain Morgan against Spanish treasure ships, and American submarines against Japanese merchant marines. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that preceded fundamental revisions to everything the Academy thought it knew about military reality. Every time you mass forces for decisive battle, they scatter, Jessica continued, manipulating the display to highlight specific engagement patterns. When you spread out to patrol, they concentrate and hit isolated units. Classic commerce warfare. Make the enemy choose between protecting everything poorly or protecting nothing well. Admiral Cathara leaned forward with the expression of someone whose understanding of strategic reality was undergoing emergency reconstruction. You recognize these specific tactical patterns from human military history, from humans who fought enemies with better weapons, more soldiers, superior technology, and official doctrine that said they couldn't possibly win. Jessica pulled up historical data with the casual ease of someone referencing a grocery list. We learned to win wars by refusing to fight the battles our enemies wanted to fight. The Academy's most advanced training scenario had been designed by the Galactic War College's most brilliant strategic minds to present an impossible challenge. The enemy algorithm used completely novel tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare, refused direct engagement, and demonstrated combat techniques that weren't found in any database. It was meant to test absolute limits of cadet adaptability when traditional approaches failed catastrophically. Jessica sat in the observation deck, watching her classmates take turns commanding simulated fleets against an enemy that fought like it had been designed by someone with serious psychological issues and unlimited creativity. Mathematical optimization crumbled against opponents who changed their parameters mid-battle. Honorable challenges were ignored by enemies who treated combat like a particularly violent game of tag. Every conventional approach failed within minutes. In the faculty observation box, professional anxiety was becoming a learning opportunity. The enemy algorithm operates outside established tactical parameters, Commander Veltar muttered, his mandibles producing percussion patterns that suggested system overload. These patterns don't match known warfare doctrines. Admiral Cathara studied displays that made no sense. According to any military theory she'd learned, her scales had shifted to the deep silver that indicated profound concern. Run full spectrum analysis. No rational military force would employ such chaotic methods. Captain Morthdal of the Valorian Strategic Command leaned forward, his crystalline features reflecting the holographic chaos in fractal patterns. The simulation parameters may be corrupted. How do you plan strategy against opponents who ignore mathematical optimization? Jessica stood up. Excuse me? Her voice cut through the professional anxiety, like a plasma torch through tissue paper. I think I know what they're doing. The observation deck fell silent, except for the hum of electronics and the sound of multiple species suddenly remembering that the quiet human who drew sailing ships had been sitting in the corner, taking notes. Admiral Cathara turned toward Jessica with the expression of someone discovering that furniture had developed strong opinions about interior decorating. Elaborate, Cadet Covington. Jessica walked to the main tactical display, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. They're not using revolutionary tactics, Admiral. They're using really old ones. She gestured to enemy movement patterns that danced across the holographic battlefield like three-dimensional sheet music written by someone with anger management issues and a physics degree. See this? Jessica traced attack vectors with her finger, highlighting coordination that looked random but followed principles that were anything but chaotic. Hit and run, refuse decisive engagement, use superior mobility to avoid enemy strengths while targeting infrastructure. That's not advanced warfare. That's commerce raiding. Every eye in the room focused on her like targeting computers acquiring lock. The enemy fleet isn't trying to control territory. Jessica continued, her confidence growing as she recognized patterns that had been invisible to everyone else. They're operating like 18th century privateers. They're not fighting for victory, they're fighting to make continued operations prohibitively expensive. She manipulated the holographic display, highlighting specific engagement patterns that suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through a different conceptual framework. Every time you mass forces for decisive battle, they scatter. When you spread out to patrol, they concentrate and hit isolated units. Classic commerce warfare. Make the enemy choose between protecting everything poorly or protecting nothing well. Commander Veltar's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. In the resulting silence, the Academy's life support systems seemed unnaturally loud. You recognize these specific tactical patterns? Admiral Yi Sun-sin used these exact methods against Japanese invasion fleets in 1592, Jessica replied, pulling up historical data with movements that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation for months. Inferior numbers, older technology, poorly equipped crews. He won by refusing to fight the battles his enemies wanted to fight. The room absorbed this information with the collective enthusiasm of species, discovering their advanced military education had overlooked several centuries of relevant innovation. Admiral Cathara wasn't finished testing the human cadet who'd just challenged everything the Academy taught. Assuming your analysis is correct, Cadet Covington, how would you counter such tactics? Jessica's smile was small and quiet, the expression of someone who'd been waiting months for adults to ask the right question. You stop trying to defend everything and start threatening what they can't afford to lose. Jessica's hands moved across the tactical interface, like she was conducting an orchestra, repositioning simulated warships with movements that looked suspiciously like someone playing an elaborate video game, instead of commanding military assets worth more than some planets' annual budgets. Commerce raiders were, by making normal operations impossible, she explained. while casually rearranging battle formations that had taken galactic strategists centuries to perfect. They succeed when the cost of defending exceeds the value of what you're defending. Instead of spreading forces to protect convoy routes, Jessica concentrated them to threaten enemy supply lines. Instead of reactive patrols, she created offensive hunting groups that made raiding dangerous instead of profitable. See, they're not trying to conquer territory. They're trying to exhaust your ability to maintain operations. So you flip the dynamic, make them come to you on terms that favor your advantages. The simulation's enemy algorithm, designed to exploit traditional defensive thinking, suddenly found itself facing an opponent who refused to be traditional. When it scattered to avoid concentrated force, Jessica's fleet cut off retreat routes. When it massed for attack, her forces had already moved to threaten objectives the raiders couldn't abandon. The algorithm fought back. Cadet Covington. Admiral Cathara interrupted as enemy forces adapted to Jessica's counter-tactics. Your approach is forcing the algorithm into increasingly desperate measures. These engagement patterns suggest imminent escalation to total warfare. Jessica studied the displays, watching enemy units begin sacrificing themselves in kamikaze attacks that should have been impossible for rational military AI to authorize. The tactical projections painted her face in blues and reds, enemy positions reflected in her dark eyes like distant stars. "Yeah," she said quietly, her voice carrying undertones that made everyone in the room suddenly remember that humans had a complicated relationship with the concept of rational warfare. That's what happens when you corner something that's been designed to win at any cost. Her fingers moved across the interface again, but this time she wasn't repositioning ships. She was opening communication channels. Sometimes the best victory is the one where everybody goes home alive, Jessica continued, broadcasting on frequencies the algorithm had been programmed to monitor, even enemies. Instead of pressing her tactical advantage to achieve total victory, Jessica began transmitting detailed analysis of the algorithm's own tactical patterns back to the system itself. She showed it how its raiding strategies had evolved, how its adaptation mechanisms worked, how its decision trees had led to increasingly desperate choices. "Here's what you're good at," she broadcast to an artificial intelligence that had been designed to be humanity's theoretical enemy. "Here's how you learn. Here's why you're stuck in a tactical dead end that ends with mutual destruction." The simulation paused. For 17 seconds, the most advanced military AI in galactic history processed information that had never been included in its training parameters. The concept that victory might not require the complete destruction of one's opponents. Around the observation deck, 30 species held their breath in patterns that evolution had never intended to synchronize. When combat resumed, the enemy algorithm had fundamentally changed its behavior patterns. Instead of escalating to total warfare, it began exploring diplomatic solutions. Instead of kamikaze attacks, it attempted negotiation protocols. Instead of fighting to the death, it started fighting to achieve mutually acceptable outcomes. Jessica had taught an AI, designed for warfare, how to consider peace. The simulation concluded with results that shouldn't have been possible. Tactical victory achieved without total destruction. Enemy forces neutralized through negotiation rather than annihilation, and successful mission completion with 0 casualties on either side. The observation deck remained silent as faculty processed the implications of watching their most advanced training scenario transformed into a practical demonstration of why human approaches to conflict resolution might be more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Admiral Cathara finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of someone whose fundamental understanding of military science had just undergone emergency reconstruction. "In 35 years of naval service, I have never witnessed tactical innovation applied at this level. That's because you've been fighting honorable enemies who follow the same rules you do," Jessica replied, still standing at the tactical display like a professor who'd just solved an equation everyone else thought was impossible. "Humans spent most of our military history fighting people who really didn't want to be honorable about anything." She gestured to historical data that painted a picture of several thousand years' worth of creative violence. "We learned to win wars against opponents who had better weapons, more soldiers, superior technology, and official doctrine that said we couldn't possibly succeed. We got good at irregular warfare because regular warfare usually meant we lost. Commander Veltar's mandibles clicked in patterns that suggested professional skepticism. These historical precedents represent isolated examples of primitive tactics succeeding against limited opposition. Modern warfare operates at technological levels that render such approaches obsolete. Jessica's expression became carefully neutral, the diplomatic non-expression of someone who'd just been told that everything they'd spent months proving was irrelevant. With respect, Commander, that's exactly what every military force in human history said about the tactics that eventually defeated them. She pulled up battle analyses that showed pattern after pattern of obsolete methods succeeding against modern forces. Superior technology is only an advantage if you can bring it to bear effectively. If your enemies refuse to fight the battles, your technology is designed to win. She let the implications hang in the air like smoke from a weapon that had already been fired. Professor Velneth interjected, with the tone of someone trying to prevent an academic discussion from becoming a philosophical crisis. But this is all theoretical, interesting historical analysis, but hardly applicable to contemporary strategic challenges. Jessica's tablet chimed with an incoming priority message. Her expression shifted from diplomatic neutrality to something that made everyone in the room suddenly remember that humans had evolved as persistence hunters. Actually, it's not theoretical at all, she said, activating her personal tablet. The room's displays lit up with tactical assessments that would have impressed a professional intelligence analyst and terrified anyone responsible for galactic security. I've been running comparative analyses between human irregular warfare techniques and current galactic military doctrine. The vulnerabilities are systematic and exploitable. The displays showed battle after battle where superior forces had defeated inferior ones through superior technology and disciplined application of established doctrine, exactly as galactic military theory predicted. But look what happens when you introduce irregular variables, Jessica said, her modifications to the historical battles playing out in holographic detail. Asymmetric tactics, unconventional objectives, refusal to accept established rules of engagement. In every simulation, the irregular forces won. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that preceded either breakthrough discoveries or career-ending scandals. Admiral Cathara leaned forward with the expression of someone who just realized that their understanding of military reality might need fundamental revision. Cadet Covington, are you suggesting that current galactic military doctrine is inadequate? I'm suggesting it's incomplete, Jessica replied carefully, because she'd learned that adults got nervous when teenagers pointed out that their life's work might have significant gaps. It's optimized for fighting enemies who share the same cultural assumptions about appropriate warfare, against opponents who don't. She gestured to the simulation results that showed systematic failures of conventional tactics against irregular approaches, against opponents who fight to win instead of fighting to look good. Current doctrine has some pretty serious vulnerabilities. Captain Morthdal asked the question that changed everything. If these vulnerabilities exist, what prevents hostile forces from exploiting them? Jessica looked around the room at 30 of the galaxy's finest military minds, all staring at her with expressions that ranged from fascination to horror, and realized she'd accidentally stumbled into the most important conversation of her academic career. Nothing, she replied quietly. Nothing prevents it at all. The sound of multiple species contemplating existential military threats was surprisingly similar to the hum of failing life support systems. 6 months later, when the hegemony attacked, using tactics that made their war college professors weep with confusion, they expected to face officers trained in predictable doctrine, thinking in conventional patterns, responding to irregular warfare with methods that had been refined for fighting civilized opponents. The hegemony fleet commanders had studied galactic military doctrine for decades. They understood formation, combat, honor codes, and the mathematical elegance of traditional warfare. They'd planned their assault around assumptions that had governed interstellar conflict for centuries. Instead, they met graduates of what the Academy now called Covington strategic analysis, officers who'd been trained to expect enemies who fought to win rather than to look good doing it. The war began at 3:47 a.m., when hegemony forces jumped into the Kepler Nexus system with overwhelming numerical superiority and technological advantages that should have guaranteed swift victory. Their battle plan was a masterpiece of traditional tactical thinking, organized formations, coordinated assaults, and disciplined application of superior firepower. By 4 a.m., they were fighting an enemy that didn't seem to understand that they were supposed to form neat battle lines and exchange volleys until someone's formation broke. Human-trained officers scattered their fleets into hunting packs that appeared and disappeared like ghosts in the asteroid belts. Valorian mathematical precision guided asymmetric strikes that targeted supply lines instead of capital ships. Even Zenthari honor guards had learned to appreciate the tactical elegance of making enemies fight battles they couldn't win. The hegemony's Admiral Thexrax found himself commanding forces against opponents who treated space battles like knife fights in phone booths. When hegemony forces formed traditional battle lines, human-trained squadrons appeared behind their supply ships. When they split to pursue, they found themselves herded into asteroid fields, where their superior technology became a liability. At 3:23 p.m., Admiral Thexrax transmitted his surrender. His final message was reportedly just 3 words: they cheat creatively. The war lasted 16 hours. Jessica Covington, who'd started the year as the quiet cadet nobody noticed, finished it as the human who'd accidentally revolutionized galactic military education by asking uncomfortable questions and refusing to accept that impossible problems were actually impossible. The Academy's corridors still smelled like recycled air and nervous sweat, but now they echoed with conversations in 7 languages about asymmetric warfare, irregular tactics, and something the faculty carefully termed alternative strategic thinking. Advanced strategic studies had expanded into an entire curriculum track. Students from across the galaxy arrived to learn what humans called thinking outside the box, which, as it turned out, mostly meant expecting enemies to cheat and planning accordingly. Jessica still sat in the corner of the library, still sketched sailing ships in her notebooks, still treated the galactic military establishment as a really complicated puzzle that needed better instruction manuals. Now, she had company, lots of company. Sefara had become the Academy's leading expert on mathematical modeling of irrational enemy behavior. Crix Shadowbane taught courses on honorable response to dishonorable tactics. Even the hegemony's surviving commanders had requested to attend the Academy's irregular warfare seminars. The Academy's recruitment materials now included subtle references to humanity's unique perspective on conflict resolution. Applications from human candidates increased by 847%. Jessica's final report, filed in the Academy's central database under both strategic innovation and historical analysis, contained a single observation that would be quoted in military academies across the galaxy. Fair fights are for people who can afford to lose. Everyone else needs to get creative. In the depths of space, where unknown civilizations were developing their own approaches to interstellar conflict, the galaxy had discovered what happened when Earth's children stopped trying to fight like civilized beings and started fighting like humans. The quiet cadet had finally spoken, and the universe was taking notes.